What is HelloFresh? With HelloFresh, you get farm fresh, pre-portioned ingredients and seasonal recipes delivered right to your doorstep. Skip the trips to the grocery store and count on HelloFresh to make home cooking easy, fun, and affordable. That's why it's America's #1 meal kit. Fall is right around the corner, and HelloFresh is there to help you plan for the busy season ahead with tasty dishes delivered right to your door. You just simply choose recipes and pick your delivery date, then lay back and enjoy the last days of summer, knowing that dinner is covered. Parents have enough back-to-school shopping and planning to do. Let HelloFresh get the groceries and save you some cash with pre-portioned meals, again, delivered right to your door. So when life gets busy, don't call for delivery, go with HelloFresh. I've been using HelloFresh for a while now, and I cannot tell you how much simpler making dinner has become. It really does give me one less thing to worry about. So go to HelloFresh.com/50whokilled and use code 50whokilled for 50% off plus free shipping. Again, go to HelloFresh.com/50whokilled and use code 50whokilled for 50% off plus free shipping. Slow Burn Media, an evergreen podcast, presents Who Killed, a podcast that provides a voice for the voiceless.
It took a jury just 3 hours to reach a verdict in the case of a disgraced former South Carolina attorney. People all around the country have been closely watching the trial of Alex Murdaugh, charged with killing his wife and son. Gloria Pazmino reports from South Carolina, where Murdaugh still insists this morning he's innocent.
Alex Murdaugh will spend the rest of his life in prison for the June 2021 murders of his wife Maggie and younger son Paul.
I respect this court, but I'm innocent.
And it might not have been you. It might have been the monster you become when you take 15, 20, 30, 40, 50, 60 opioid pills.
During the nearly 6-week trial, Murdaugh admitting on the stand he lied to investigators about where he was on the night Maggie and Paul were killed, blaming the lies on drug-fueled paranoia, and acknowledging it's his voice in the background of a video Paul took at the family's dog kennels, moments before Paul and Maggie died there.
Hey, he's got a bird in his mouth!
Friday, the prosecution reacting to the sentencing.
It's tragic, it's sad. God bless Bubba.
And one juror breaking his silence.
When he said it was him, were you surprised?
I was very surprised.
Why?
That was his only savior right there.
The defense planning to file an intent to appeal Murdaugh's conviction within 10 days, based on the admission of evidence of his alleged financial crimes into the trial. Reporting in Walterboro, South Carolina, Gloria Pazmino. Back to you.
Hello and welcome to this week's episode of Who Killed? I'm your host, Bill Huffman, and this is a Slow Burn Media, Evergreen Podcasts, and Killer Podcast production. On this week's episode, we are going to join another podcast, Crime Capsule. It's a show that I produce for Killer Podcasts as well as Evergreen Podcasts. And on this week's show, we discuss the Alex Murdaugh murder trial. And we have a guest named Rita Shuler, who spent 20 plus years working for SLED, which is the law enforcement division that was investigating this crime. And she provides a lot of insight. Now, Ben, he hosts the show, and he does take the first 40 minutes of the show to interview Rita, and she gets really good insight into the case. And if you guys hang in there, I jump in about 40 minutes in, and this is sort of a supersized episode, but then again, this is also a supersized case. So if you want to hear from one of the experts of the case and someone who actually lives in the area and worked under the Murdaugh family throughout a number of years, then definitely check out this week's episode. So again, appreciate you guys tuning in and enjoy this crossover with Crime Capsule.
Welcome back to Crime Capsule. I'm your host, Benjamin Morris. Today, we are thrilled to present a very special show, an extended episode that takes place at the intersection of American history and the American present. Unless you've been living under a rock, which is totally cool, we're down with that. By now, you have heard the results of a murder investigation that has gripped the country for the last 2 years. As strange, convoluted, and intense as the trial itself was these past few months, so too was the intensity of its ending. Alex Murdaugh, convicted of the murders of his wife Maggie and son Paul, and sentenced to life in prison in one of the most spectacular falls from grace the justice system has seen in years. The twists and turns in this case were too numerous to count, and our heads are still reeling. But thankfully, we don't have to make sense out of it alone. Here to guide us through it all is none other than Crime Capsule's very own Lieutenant Rita Shuler, retired special investigator for the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, SLED, which handled the Murdaugh case. For those listeners who may not know Rita, she was our second guest on the show, back when we were still just a little baby podcast first starting out. Rita's extraordinary journey in cracking a 40-year-old cold case in this same region of South Carolina served as the basis for her book, The Lowcountry Murder of Gwendolyn Elaine Fogle, A Cold Case Solved, a book which was published by the History Press back in 2021. If you haven't heard those episodes, let me encourage you to dig back into our archives and seek them out, because they are truly riveting, and you'll hear echoes of that story today. You can find them on our show page at evergreenpodcasts.com or on your podcast provider. Either way, you'll hear Rita's crack investigator's instinct come right to the fore, right here, both then and now, as we dive deep into the downfall of Alex Murdaugh. Rita, one of my absolute favorite things to say on this show is welcome back to Crime Capsule. We are so delighted to have you join us again on such an incredible week.
Well, thank you very much, Ben. It is my pleasure to be here.
So for our listeners who have not yet had the pleasure of your acquaintance, will you just tell us a little bit about your background and your career?
Well, I was supervisory special agent for the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division, which is known as SLED, and I was supervisor of the forensic photography department, and I was a part of the crime scene investigation team. Now, crime scene investigators would go to the crime scene. I did not go to the crime scene unless specialized photography was needed, because they were trained in it. And what they did, they kind of went to the crime scene, gathered the evidence, processed the scene. They kind of brought the crime scene back into me, to the studio, and if they needed follow-up, specialized photography, I had my lab set up. I called it my little FBI lab, actually, because I went to the FBI, and I had a 3 weeks course there, and I came back and set up SLED's forensic photography department like that. So my main duty was taking care of the evidence, and back then we did 35 millimeter film. We didn't have the luxury of digital, so I had to develop the film. I had to print the film, and even some of the local agencies would send their film into me from crime scene if SLED did not work on it, and I actually helped them with that too. So my main purpose was, and my main duty was, to photograph evidence and work with the crime scene investigators to try and assist them to come up with the best photographs of like fingerprints, shoe prints, or anything off the evidence they brought back to me in the lab. And I had a lab where they could bring in their evidence then. I mean, they could bring in a door. It was that big a lab, and we had to photograph any prints or whatever they wanted me to photograph. trace evidence, fraction marks, anything of that nature. So I just took care of all the evidence that they would bring back from the crime scene.
And this experience is something which, over the course of the last several months, as the trial of the century, as some folks have called it, has gotten underway. I mean, I know you have a very real reaction to some of the things that you've been watching as you followed the trial. Now, before we get into the trial itself, you served at SLED for 25 years before your retirement. You're born and raised in the Lowcountry of South Carolina, and you have worked with state, local, sometimes federal officials in the line of duty. You know better than most what it was like to labor under this shadow empire of influence and so-called justice of the Murdaugh clan. Tell us, what was it like working in, around, alongside, maybe not the right word, but what was it like working in the shadow of the Murdaughs?
Well, from day one, when I went to SLED, and we did investigations, I guess the first scene that SLED went to after I went to SLED, and they brought all the film back to me and all the processing evidence that they wanted me to process and photograph. They told me about the Murdaughs, that they were the powerful family down there. They are in the 14th Circuit. They are solicitors, and this started way back with, I don't know how many generations back. But that was always known that the Murdaughs were powerful. They had a dynasty. They'd been there for years. And so when you get a case in here for the Murdaughs, we really need for you to work on them. And that was just another thing for me. I mean, it didn't matter who they were, because I took pride in everything that I did and in every special procedure that I needed to do, whether it was them or not.
Let me ask you this. I recall that you have described instances in which you would be invited to certain events, and members of the sort of Murdaugh clan, the extended Murdaugh clan, would be there sort of mingling with law enforcement and so forth. And you described this as sort of seeing that old boy network, or kind of feeling some unease about certain gatherings or official events where folks were getting kind of buddy-buddy. The South, as we know, is a very interconnected kind of place, but you more or less kept your distance from that, didn't you? You chose not to participate in many of those kinds of gatherings.
The reason I chose not to participate was mainly because I was a part of that crime scene team, and all the investigators at SLED, they knew the Murdaughs, and a lot of our guys hunted, and they loved to go hunting, and they were invited down to the Murdaughs cookouts and hunting, for days and weeks. Well, being a part of the scene, they would tell me, Rita, you can go too, which I myself said, I really am not a hunter, and I don't want to really be down there with all you guys. So that's the reason I didn't go. It was not because of any prestige with the Murdaugh family and the good old boy system. I just didn't want to go down there with all the guys. But I felt a little privilege for them asking me. And it wasn't back then as prominent as it is now, in my opinion. And because of this trial as well, I had no idea that all this was going on with Alex. And I really didn't know him, because I mainly worked with it would have been his dad that was during the era that I worked at SLED.
Let me ask you, June 2021 was when Maggie and Paul were killed, when Alex killed Maggie and Paul. Where were you when you first heard about this, and what was your reaction?
I was in my living room and I got a notification from one of our local TV stations. And I do have that on my phone that I get notifications when anything happens. And I just kind of looked at it and I went, oh my God. Well, my first thought was, and I had heard about the boat, the boat crash. And my first thought was, oh gosh, is somebody retaliating against the Murdaughs because of the boat crash and how it was handled? And then I heard the statement of, we do not think there's any threat to the public. I think that was the way that they put it, and that's when I started thinking. I said, then they know pretty much who might have done this, because we would say that a lot too in some of our investigations. Don't think it's any threat to the public because we pretty much know who done this. We've just got to prove it. And that was my first thought, and I went, oh God, did Alex do this himself? And I, at the time, did not know that he had done all this financial stuff. I learned that after SLED started investigating, and the social media. I mean, the news channels, they had it all on there. That's when I learned, and I said, yeah, he could do it. That is totally my opinion. I said, yes, he could have done this. And the next thing was, being the Murdaugh family, if they thought somebody else did this, they put up that reward and they had a date that it was expiration date on it. And I said, I've never heard of that.
Yeah, it's weird.
I've never heard of that. But being the Murdaugh family, I thought they would have been camped on SLED's doorstep and the Attorney General's doorstep saying, you find out who killed Maggie and Paul, who killed my beloved wife, who killed my beloved son. But they didn't do that. That was not done. They didn't camp out. And I think later on, I think Alex put up a reward too, him and Buster. And I'm saying, there's money again, but I just can't see them with their name too, of not demanding find out who did this. That was not in the media hardly at all.
It doesn't really pass the smell test, does it? Something's off.
That's a good way of putting it. Mm-hmm.
It's a funny thing. You've got this, remarkable insight, both as a trained professional and as a local, which is so interesting to hear. Next time I get an APB on my phone or I'm watching TV and I hear someone say, law enforcement say, not a threat to the public, I think I'm going to know exactly what that means now. And I really appreciate that as a tip.
That was used a lot in some investigations. My guys would come back from the crime scene and they'd say, okay, we think it's this one person and they're not a threat to the public. And then, of course, you have to deal with the evidence and see if it is that person. Everything you can do.
Well, let me ask you, I know that it is for sort of integrity of the investigation and so forth, your colleagues at SLED would not have been able to talk about things as they progressed. But as a resident of the area, someone who knows, Southeast South Carolina and, the Lowcountry so well, what have the past 2 years leading up to this trial, what have they been like at home? Folks must be talking about this in the diners, the barbershops, the mom and pops. It must be on everybody's mind, right? What has that been like?
Absolutely. And here, I'm 45 miles away from Walterboro. And after all this happened, you're correct. That was the conversation. And everybody's kind of doing the Monday morning quarterback. And it was just conversation. If you went somewhere and didn't have anything to talk about, then you start talking about the Murdaughs being killed, Paul and Maggie being killed, if you didn't have anything to talk about. And it was just, I think it was kind of a shock that this has happened to this prominent family in Walterboro, South Carolina. Now it's taken over the nation, and the whole nation knows where Walterboro, South Carolina is now. I think I live about 45 miles from Walterboro and just about 7 or 8 miles out of Charleston, South Carolina, which everybody knows where that is. I'm thinking, and people have asked me, how far do you live from Walterboro? I'm thinking people are going to say now, okay, Johns Island is 45 miles from Walterboro, instead of being 7 miles from Charleston.
Right, you've put yourself on the map now.
Yeah, and I love Walterboro. I really do. As you know, one of my career cases was in Walterboro that we solved a murder after 35 years. And I do love Walterboro. I've been over there so much, and I have friends there, and I have professional friends there, and investigative friends there, and it's been dear to my heart.
Well, let's take a look at the trial. We are recording this on really the tail end of one of the most dramatic 24-hour periods in your area's history. The verdict was announced last night, and the sentence was announced this morning, just a few hours ago. So we are really kind of right on the edge of this occasion. You have seen a lot of investigations over the years. You have participated in them, contributed to them. When you look at Alex's trial, what are some of the key differences that you see compared to how they were done in years past and how this particular investigation was conducted?
Okay, I've been going for 21 years, and technology has just taken over. And back in my day, it was more hands-on. So we would go to the scene, we'd kind of bring the scene back in the SLED, the evidence back in the SLED. I didn't see too much evidence I saw evidence that they gathered that went back to SLED, but then there was some evidence that could have been gathered that they probably didn't. But at the time that they were doing the crime scene investigation, that first night, they may not have looked at Alex as a suspect. And so, the thing about the clothes, they said his clothes were clean and they smell good. And from what I understand, there was no blood spatter on the clothes he was wearing. But then there was a question about the other clothes. They did take the shirt and the shorts in, but they never found the other clothes. And I've got to admit, Alex Murdaugh, he knew what they would be looking for, and apparently he knew how to get rid of it. And one of the experts that testified, Kenny Kinsey, Dr. Kenny Kinsey, he actually spent time in my photography lab back in the years when I was there, kind of like an intern when he was starting out. And I noticed in his testimony, he went back to old school sometime. And as he said, there's a shoe print on the floor, bloody shoe print, that wasn't photographed. And if it should have been. To me, it should have been, even if it belonged to Paul or whoever it belonged to, or belonged to nobody. You can eliminate it. or it might have belonged to somebody, but you have to find the shoes too. But that wasn't done, and I wasn't at the scene, so I really can't say what was done. But our guys used to, like I said, if they saw a shoe print in sand, they would do a plastic cast of it, bring it back to headquarters, and I would photograph it. And I understand there was a lot of shoe prints and all around this scene. And again, I wasn't there, so I couldn't tell. But I don't think our guys would have let everyone that went into that scene. That was just something to me. But again, everything's changed since I was there. But they didn't do that back in my day.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because now you have the kind of evidence that can be collected on the actual premises, evidence from the scene, and then you also have this evidence, the technological evidence of the sort of the GPS tracking, which proved, and the sort of cell phone communications, right, which really have kind of come into the fore in the last 20 years. That kind of evidence proved pivotal here, didn't it, in the trial? The sort of the Snapchat video, the recordings, monitoring where people were at the time. I mean, do you think Alex just, was ignorant of that, overlooked that, in the sort of panic and the haste? I mean, that's the one thing he couldn't destroy, right?
Right. I think Alex knew a lot about it because, he tried to open Paul's phone, and he tried to open Maggie's phone as the testimony went. I do believe that he knew a lot about this, but he didn't know the extensive part of where they could almost trace every footstep of him. And I'm sure he's testified in court about this too, when even back when he was doing his court proceedings on one of his cases, I'm sure he brought in cell phone data, and I don't know about the OnStar back then, but I would think OnStar would be there, and he had to use the telephone data and all too to make his case. So he knew about all that. He also knew how to get rid of evidence, I think. He also knew how to get rid of his clothes, and I still can't get my head around that, but he knew how to do that. Because, the lack of evidence sometimes tells you something. The lack of his clothes, the lack of blood on his clothes, that tells its own story as well. The lack of them not finding the guns.
Right. The murder weapons themselves. They found ammunition which matched the
that is true.
The sort of the weapons that were fired, but they didn't actually find the weapons themselves.
Yep, and that was a big point too, because the shell casings they found outside the door and the shell casings they found at the crime scene, I mean, they were a match or either shot from a gun, like they said, with the same specs to them.
Now, take us, I know, of course, you were not at that scene, but in a scene like it, take us through the step of, say, for the shell casings in particular, are they photographed first where they are found to preserve sort of placement and then brought back to SLED, or are they just brought back to SLED first and then kind of reconstructed thereafter?
They should have been photographed when they saw the shell casings, wherever they were. And we did a 90-degree angle, so it would be perpendicular with a scale in it. Our guys put a scale in everything. And that is the way, when it comes back to me, that if they need to do an exact size on it, the scale is in the suspected cartridges. And then if they have the real cartridges, then I can do a 1-to-1 of each one, and you see how it matches up. But it has to be the exact size in order to make sure it's in the exact inch or in the exact corner or whatever. It has to be that exact size. So that's the reason they put they should put rulers in there. In this case, I don't know. I don't remember, but they should take photographs at the scene, and then possibly when they get back to do the analysis, of course, they'll take photographs then too as well. But you should photograph the scene exactly how it is when you get there, and all the evidence, because that's the beauty of photography. It shows exactly how the assailant left it, and film as we used, and now digital, can be filed, and it can be worked on later on. You can go back. You can use those crime scene photographs to actually kind of reconstruct a crime scene. But everything should be photographed. Our guys started at the signpost outside, and they just walked on in and took photographs of everything.
I'm curious because, you have described how canny, how savvy, Alex is, how he's sort of always thinking about the possibilities and trying to stay a step ahead of, law enforcement and that kind of stuff. What is your approach when you encounter a crime scene that you suspect may have been manipulated by the very perpetrator, right? So if Alex is trying to kind of place something in a way that leads to a different conclusion than what actually happened, how are you able to kind of remove that filter, so to speak, or kind of take that layer of I don't even know what the word is, but like how do you remove his influence, which was added after the actual murder?
Well, again, I didn't go to the crime scenes unless they needed specialized photography. Our investigators went there, and then we got together when they brought them back, and I was a part of it when they brought it back, but I didn't do the original investigation. We had that investigative team to do that. Well, you kind of look at things, and if anything is out of place or where it's not supposed to be, such as, they kind of elaborated on that hose being out of place, and that's one thing. And when you talk to the witnesses like they did, they said, no, that hose was on, wrapped up real nice on it. And then when I think in the picture, maybe the kennel picture, anyway, it was out of place. So you look for anything that's out of place. And they asked Alex too, is there anything out of place? And he said, no, not particularly. And they would have to talk to other witnesses, though, if they saw something that they thought was maybe out of place. They would talk to other witnesses like they did the dog handler and ask him about, okay, how about this hose? Where is it supposed to be? And you can take those photographs even after you're away from the crime scene, and you can reconstruct a crime scene from it, just like Dr. Kenny Kinsey did. And I think the defense had one too that kind of reconstructed. Of course, they were not parallel with each other, but just anything that's out of place, and change your habits during the day, just like they talked to him about, change your habits. That's something that you really need to look at.
This case, all trials of this nature, they live and die by the evidence that's presented. And you've mentioned sort of the blood spatter on the T-shirt, and maybe in one or two other spots. You've mentioned the sort of technology and the cell phones. Were there any other evidentiary issues that really stood out for you as you were watching this trial, either that came out of the testimony or just things that they were presenting, like angles of gunshots or, kind of the what was searched, what was not searched? I mean, was there any kind of, as you're following this whole saga along, were there any like real red flags, that jumped out for you?
My first red flag, and I had heard this in a podcast before, and I don't, I'd say, okay, that might be right, but I'm going to watch the trial and see the positive evidence or the circumstantial evidence or whatever. And yes, when I had heard there was a video that Paul had. I had no idea what it was, and I don't know if anybody had any idea what it was until the trial. But the first red flag for me, as I told you, there's no threat to the community. The second red flag was when I watched that video and I heard Alex's voice in there, and I said, oh, hell. I said, that is Alex's voice. He has a distinct voice. That is his voice. He was at the scene, and I had already seen some of the testimony on the timeline. And when I heard that voice, and I went, oh my goodness, I said, he was there like a minute or so, and he lied about it. And that's one thing our investigators don't like, is somebody lying to them, somebody lying to law enforcement. It's like, if you find a fingerprint or a shoe print or a footprint at a crime scene, and you get a suspect and you question them, and you're really looking at this, he's kind of a firm suspect here. And when they talked to him, one of the first things they would ask was, were you ever in this house? Were you ever at this scene where it happened? And if they say no, and you've already matched their shoes up to the shoe print, matched their footprint up to the footprint, fingerprint up to the fingerprint, and now DNA, well, how do you tell us you weren't there when we have your fingerprints? How did you?
You're digging your own grave. I mean, you're in trouble at that point, and
How did they get there?
Yeah.
I mean, we even had suspects tell us, well, that is my shoe print, but somebody must have stole that shoe out of the closet and wore it that night. Like I said, they don't like lies, and that would be the first lie. In my 37-year-old case that was just solved, they asked him, the person, and have you ever been in Elaine's house? And he said no. And of course, Chief Johnson asked him, well, how do you explain that your fingerprints and your palm prints were in that house? Well, they knew he lied. And that was, they pretty much had him then, they knew he lied.
Bagged and tagged.
But it's that simple with the fingerprints are wonderful. They'll never go away because nobody has the same fingerprints, but identical twins do have the same DNA. So if you find DNA at a crime scene and you think one of these twins did it, you pray for a fingerprint. So, that's the way you differentiate that, because no two fingerprints alike. But yeah, and catching him in a lie, and when I saw that video, I went, oh my God. So that was number one. And then him having no blood on his clothes. They couldn't find any. I think they found a little spot of blood and DNA maybe on the steering wheel. But that pretty much tells you if he did this, he changed clothes. But I tell you, he covered it up. I've got to admit that, boy. He cleaned up or whatever he did, because they didn't find any blood, and that had to be a bloody scene. I myself wonder if he didn't change clothes down there and drive home in that golf cart naked. That was one of my thoughts. That was one of my thoughts too. But he did a good job of getting rid of the blood and the bloody clothes. But I mean, of course, they had their ideas of how he did that.
Yeah, it makes you wonder if, one day down the road, some of that evidence will in fact turn up on the property, on the land.
You're thinking just like me.
There
are hunters in that area every day. If he threw a gun out in the woods, or he threw clothes out in the woods, or even the waterways down there, sometimes they dry up. I said, one day somebody might say, God, look at this gun here,
Yeah, what's that shotgun doing in the bottom of the bayou? Let me go check that out. Up it comes, and then there we are.
And you don't know where he put his clothes. I mean, he could have thrown them in somebody's dipsty dumpster on his way or whatever, and the next day they were gone. But he did a good job with that now.
Well, before we switch gears, let me ask you, I got two questions for you. Number one, what did you make of the two-shooter theory? There's somebody else up, one on one hill and the other downhill, and that kind of, what when that first was floated, what was your take?
I didn't think it at all. I knew from the past, as I told you, these people down there are hunters. This family was they were living in a hunting lodge, that's what they called it. And they were big hunters. They had guns all over the place. And once I saw this video and put him down there and the timeline came in, I said, man, he could have done this. He was an expert with guns. And he may have even carried the guns down on the golf cart. I don't know if they ever decided how he got them there, but he could have gone down on the golf cart with Maggie and Paul and, let's put the guns in here, Paul. Might be able to kill us a pig.
You get us a hog. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And if he had those guns in that golf cart when he was there, and they say Paul was shot first, he could have shot Paul, and Maggie, like they said, came running to her son, her baby, and then he just picked up the other one and turned around and shot her. Now, here's one thing I found interesting, too, with Dr. Kenny Kinsey. He found a pattern on the back of Maggie's thigh. And he saw this. He didn't go to the crime scene. He was an expert brought in, and that's the one I told you I've known for years. And he's actually from my home county, Orangeburg County, here in South Carolina. But when I was listening to him and I heard that, he said there was a pattern on the back of Maggie's thigh. And he told how he took it. It appeared to be mud, and it had a design like the tire on the Polaris, the ATV. And boy, I just zoomed into that because that's what we did at SLED so much. And even when he was up there too, his 2 weeks, we were doing some of that. But he decided he said, this is a good pattern trait here is what we called it. And he took photographs of the ATV, tires on the ATV, and the photograph of the pattern on her leg. And of course, again, you have your scales in there so you can do it 1-to-1 and make the pattern 1-to-1 and make the tire 1-to-1. You enlarge it to that size. And he was able to overlay it, and with being a certainty, he said that pattern on the back of Maggie's leg was the impression of it had the designs of the tire of the ATV. It was a
match. He got a match, yeah.
Correct. And there again, he explained how you had to reverse one. He talked in good plain language and common sense, but then again, he was back from my era. And I could follow this a lot more. But that would tell you too that at some point her leg came in contact with that tire on the ATV. Now, whether it was when she was shot and she fell back, or she was walking back to get away, but at some point her thigh got in contact with that ATV. And he did that from the photographs, I think it was the autopsy photographs. And I kind of want to say that he said there wasn't a scale in the, seems like to me he said there wasn't a scale, so he got as close as he could with his photograph of the tire and that scale to the pattern trait on the back of.
It's nice to see a little old-fashioned gumshoeing coming to fruition, isn't it?
Tell me about it. And he even went as far as to say, back in the old days, we used to just reverse the negative and just turn the negative upside down on one or the other. And of course, now you can do this digital. I mean, it's pretty simple. I mean, I've done some of that digital too. So.
Very satisfying. Very, very satisfying.
Mm-hmm. But that to me was a good piece of evidence too, because it placed her at the crime scene. It placed her there, and either she backed up on it or however it got there, somehow that tire came in contact with her thigh.
You know, the that kind of hard evidence stands against the claim by the defense that, you know, all the state had here was circumstantial. Just circumstantial was, you know, the sort of the.
And, you know, you've got to look at that as circumstantial too, I guess. Although it was direct, you might have to look at that as circumstantial here too, because they could say all day long it doesn't match up, but he had it matching up.
Well, that's what I want to ask you, is that you have this kind of, I think that the defense was correct in the sense that, yes, there was mostly circumstantial evidence.
Sure,
okay.
I'll agree. But cases have been made on circumstantial evidence. A lot of cases have been made, but you've got to work with it. You've got to work with it. And they work with it. And
that's the question is sort of, you know, in some cases, circumstantial is not enough to, you know, to convict. But in this case, it was. Why do you think that it was here for Alex Murdaugh?
Oh, my goodness. And just these digital records, too, of the phone and the OnStar, they traced him around everywhere. They had as many steps as he took. And him, I think it was one question there, is he had a lot of steps after he got back to the scene when he was calling 911 or something. He was probably just twirling around in circles, you know, talking to him, whatever. But that technology, it can trace your steps. It can trace your car. It can trace your mileage. It can trace your speed. And there's just no denying that. It may be a little off, but it's not that much off. And I mean, in that video, I mean, they might say that's circumstantial, but that video had Alex on there like 2 minutes before the time of death.
It's too close. Mm-hmm. It is too.
But they have all the technology there, and then you can again go back to the photographs, and you can actually reconstruct that photograph and show the angles of the bullets, it's just wonderful technology and old school, but it still takes a human to make it work. There has to be a human there to do all this to make it work. And they had them. They had the good experts.
Well, Rita, I can't thank you enough for your perspective on this. It truly is fascinating, and I know that I have learned a lot hearing your expertise come to light, to shed light on this particular trial. I want to bring in a voice who has been waiting in the wings here, our esteemed producer, Bill Huffman, who has been following this trial for quite some time. This is a major case, and Bill, of course, is the host of his own show called Who Killed, and has a number of reactions to Alex Murdaugh's convictions. I mean, Bill, first question I have for you is, did you have any doubt about this verdict, or were you too thinking maybe hung jury, retrial, kind of extended deliberation? What was your take on the verdict?
Well, first, thanks for having me on the show, and being in the background all the time and not being able to voice my 2 cents. It's it does grate on you a little bit, but thank you very much for letting me voice a couple comments here. I actually thought this was a slam dunk, in my opinion, when it comes to a circumstantial case. I've looked at other cases that people have been convicted on a lot less stuff than what they had on him. And I mean, I think Rita has basically laid out the digital footprint. With what they have nowadays, the ability to track your every move, basically, it's not surprising to me at all. Was I surprised that the verdict came back so quickly? Yes, but I think if you looked at the trial, the prosecution really did, and I have a couple questions about how they did this. The way that they portrayed the case and portrayed Alec being in this situation where he's addicted to so many drugs, which, Rita, did you find it odd that, I don't know, he just doesn't seem like a drug addict in the sense that he would be taking 60 pills a day? I mean, in my opinion, what my image is of somebody like that, I guess he doesn't fall into that. Do you think they were exaggerating that to try to get some sympathy or empathy towards Alec?
My personal opinion, yes. But I've never done drugs. I really don't know anybody that's ever taken that much drugs. I think there was one comment that he said he took 1,000 a day. I think you would be dead if you took 1,000 a day. Now, I don't know. This is just my opinion. I know some people who say they know drug addicts that they don't know what they're doing or everything, and I can understand that too. But he just did not fit that to me.
Well,
I didn't buy that. Sure, maybe he was on drugs, and he had some opioids in his system after the suicide attempt, so-called suicide attempt. And they did find some opioid drugs there. But he picked up on that real good, and that's the reason he lied about the not being at the kennel, because he got paranoid. No, I don't buy that.
I don't either, and I don't see how you can do and function the way that he was and conniving the way that he was, not even regardless of the murders, the financial crimes, how he was able to do that while he's all doped up. I mean, this isn't we're not talking cocaine or amphetamines. We're talking about opioids. I mean, this is stuff that puts you out.
I didn't buy it. I think there was a lot of people that didn't buy it.
The jury didn't buy it either because they could see him. Generally, when somebody has an addiction like that, they suffer major withdrawals. And
absolutely. And you just hit it right there. He said he was in detox for 7 days. And then we don't know where he was. They say he was there, but I don't know if they really know where he was. But for 7 days, you would still have withdrawals after that, I would think.
And you think they were using this to justify his stealing of clients' money.
Absolutely.
And that's where my next question goes is, where does the financial aspect of this case go now? Is it still pursued? Because, I mean, there's still victims out there.
They may go to trial now. It could be possible. They said, we don't need to go to trial on this, but he's got 1 or 2 other cases that SLED is looking into now, the Gloria Satterfield and definitely Stephen Smith. You hadn't heard much about that since they said they reopened it, but those aren't resolved yet either.
Is Stephen the one that's connected to the Buster?
Yes.
Yeah,
supposedly.
So
yeah,
it's just
he went to school.
creepy.
He was in the same class as Buster, I heard, and then of course, they kind of related that they might have had a good relationship.
Very interesting how they all seem to cross paths with death in some way or another. And then in your history of working with SLED, did you ever see anything that you thought was not on the up and up in the decades that you worked there? Because of their, pull.
With SLED?
You mean the Murdaughs in particular, the Murdaughs' influence?
Yeah, the Murdaughs, like the prosecution, being able to prosecute and just kind of running roughshod over like the local authorities. I mean, you're basically the boss.
Well, you hear that. I never, I wasn't involved in any of that. I never saw anything, but I mean, we've heard it. And you ask a local, I'm sure some of the locals will say yes too. And, don't second guess the locals because they're the ones that live there. But as far as me, no investigations that I knew of, or even our guys did, I don't remember doing that. But yes, there is speculation out there that could be too.
Because I just wonder how far the apple fell from the tree. It just seems like with their great grandfather being the prosecutor, all the the family tree, we see it. It's all prosecutors, and then Alex is a little different path, and I mean he was still successful, but it's just very dynasty soap opera, low country. It's got a lot of, I think there's a reason it captured the national attention. I mean, it just really shows what power and greed and
they could get away with it, and they got away. Alex got away with it. He did
for so long.
And you're right. It was apple falling from a tree. He got away with it, and I think that dynasty is ended now. It sounds like, because
what happens with the Mallory Beach and the Paul boat accident stuff, and I know that you can't do anything with the prosecution or anything like that, but I mean these people lost a child, and it just seems so unfair that he won't face any. I mean, I know he faced the ultimate punishment, I guess, because he was taken out by his father, but he still committed a crime, and they all seem to be just a bunch of troublemakers. And I don't understand how this side of the family became such an enigma, compared to the rest of the people.
Well, as far as that boat case, I think that pretty much started all this and people looking at it. I remember when it happened, and I myself said, they're not going to do anything with this because it's a Murdaugh. That was just my impression from hearing the dynasty and knowing about the dynasty, and knowing about how powerful they were when I worked with SLED, even back, 20 years ago now, and 25 years ago. And it didn't go anywhere. And you think about, I don't believe in coincidences. I believe in conveniences, maybe is the word for it. And Alex was looking at the lawsuit with Paul and the boat case. 3 days later was when it was going to court. And he killed them 3 days before it went to court. Is that convenience? Then bless Pete, his daddy died a couple days, 3 days after all this happened.
It's a fascinating sequence of events because, in one frame has everything line up perfectly, and then the other frame, of course, says no, it was all just coincidental. I think one thing that this trial has shown is that, anyone with a bone of common sense in their body just doesn't accept that coincidental narrative either. I think, Rita, you're absolutely, right about that. Well, I think you're right. I think you're absolutely spot on. And, it is interesting. I did read one report which speaks to Bill's question about his legal vulnerability for these other cases. And it does suggest, the Guardian was reporting that he still could be charged for those murders.
Yes,
but the state has not yet gotten enough evidence to prove, his involvement in them. And sort of, even if they did, since he's already facing life in prison, it would just be kind of up to the DA's discretion as to whether or not they would add these charges onto his current situation, right? They don't necessarily have to. He's not coming out. Right?
This is true, but hopefully they will investigate some, for the family's sake, and to maybe bring I don't believe in closure either, but to bring some peace to the families. And I do hope they do that because, they have opened back up all of these supposedly, that's been out that they've opened these up, and hopefully they will go back and investigate that too. Who knows what you might find? You might find something about this case too you didn't know, which we don't need that now, but it'd be like finding that gun in the woods.
Yeah, can I play devil's advocate real quick and ask Bill the same question that I asked you, Rita? There is always a chance that somebody with an exterior motive, that the third person, the third party, that there was an individual out there who had a motive to come onto their land and conduct these murders and try to, gain some financial leverage, all the different kind of rationales and stuff. Bill, did you ever see anything in the defense's case that you found even remotely plausible, or like that you felt like the prosecution did not adequately respond to? Trying to see both sides here, right?
Personally, I feel like they did a decent job setting up the drug dealer, drug perspective, and I think that's kind of why they ran with the whole addiction and the opioids, and it's the hot topic in the country, an epidemic going on, and let's throw Alec in there, and he'll be fine. We'll say he's got this problem, and then he's spending this much money on drugs, and then he owes this much money to a drug dealer, and hey, drug dealers kill for less than, let's say they have $10,000.
You got to pay them.
They'll kill them. You got to pay them. And so, it's very plausible. That was a plausible idea. But again, it was kind of a concocted story to fit the circumstances. So it's more like you're saying, okay, yeah, let's run with that aspect of it with the drug addiction, because that brings in shady characters, opposed to him committing these financial crimes, whereas that's just him just being shady. Whereas this brings in other people that could potentially cause harm. Was it a last-ditch effort to really kind of distract the jury? Yeah, of course it was. This guy was dead to rights, in my opinion. Everybody suspected him. Rita, we had you on pretty much right after he was shot.
Yes, I know. Gosh, you take me back. I don't remember. So this had happened before I was on before?
And you were like, oh yeah, he's totally involved. And I wouldn't be surprised if he killed Paul and Maggie. So you nailed this.
You called it.
You called it, because it was, I think you were on in July of last year, or of 2021, or August, and yeah, it was you had your 2 cents, and you were damn right. You were right on the money.
I've got to tell you this. One of my high school boys, he lives down in Hilton Head, and he actually worked with Russell Lafitte, one of the other attorneys that I think he just got sentenced. I don't know if he's sentenced yet, but anyhow, he got convicted. And Fred called me up, and he said, well, Rita, he said, are you going to write a book on the Murdaughs? And I went, yeah, I can saw on Alex Murdaugh. He said, are you going to write a book on Alex Murdaugh? And I said, yeah, it'd be 3 words. He did it.
So I have one last question for you, and that is, it was interesting to see the press conference last night after the verdict, and to see the state attorney general and everybody, it was like a celebration of the lives of Paul and Maggie, but it was also like a celebration of like, we took down the king. like we took down the king, you know, they're no more in power. You know, we cut the head off the snake or the dragon or whatever you want to reference. And it just seemed like a celebration opposed to, sometimes you don't really see that very often. And the state attorney general, you know, I guess he questioned one of the final witnesses and that's just, is that a pretty common thing to do, or is that like everybody wanted to have a hand in this?
It's not a common thing to do, I don't think. You know, they're happy, but there's never been a case in South Carolina like this case. If you would take it back, it would have to be Pee Wee Gaskins. And you know Pee Wee Gaskins. He went through South Carolina and he killed for years and years and years. But there's never been a case in South Carolina like this. And that's another thing. The SLED investigators have never had to investigate a case like this. This has just been a snowball effect, that one thing after the other, and they had to find out what was right, what was wrong, and I think they were just celebrating that we finally got justice in South Carolina one time on a case this big. And it was this powerful family, because they did a lot of good work, SLED and the state and attorney general. But they've just never had a case in South Carolina like this, not in my lifetime, except for maybe Pee Wee Gaskins. And his wasn't even this extensive, I don't think, because he'd tell them where a body was. They knew he was guilty.
It's just amazing how quickly they turned it around and already have a conviction and sentence.
I think the people, you know, Walterboro, the people down there, they know about guns. A lot of them hunt. They know about all-terrain vehicles. They know about dog kennels. They've all got them. And I do believe they put together, this didn't have to be two shooters. And we know how Alex and those loved hunting, and they knew guns upside down and backwards. And I just really believe these jurors, and they were the local people who had lived in this dynasty, knowing that the Murdaughs were called the dynasty for years. And of course, they'd heard the media before. And I think they just knew how it worked down there. They were down-to-earth people. I mean, what was the first thing that put Alex at the kennel? It was a simple video of a dog's tail and done by Paul for a friend of his. That video put Alex at the kennels, and that dog's tail, if it wouldn't have been for that dog's tail, we wouldn't have that video maybe, you know, something that simple.
You know, Rita, you nail it right here, because Southern folks, we know when someone is trying to pull the wool over our eyes. We can just tell, you know, there's a little hair on the back of our neck that stands up, you know, there's just, you know, you don't need all the fancy degrees in the world from all the fanciest institutions. You can have someone who knows dogs, knows guns, and, you know, knows trucks, and they can be absolutely every bit as much of an expert as any witness that anybody else will call. And you can just, you know, it's very, I too get a little annoyed, you know, when there's a sort of outside perception of, oh, those dumb jurors, they wouldn't know how to, you know, add two and two together. It's like, well, hold on, you know, like we actually have a little bit more credibility than that. It was interesting. There were two jurors that were holding out at the very end. The Guardian reported that there were two who were kind of unsure, you know, in the last moments, but it was the cell phone evidence that ultimately persuaded them, and they've gone on the record, to say so. And it's just...
And they had so much, all of this testimony too, that's back and forth of the same thing over and over. It was confusing. I was really glad to see the prosecution have a PowerPoint presentation there and kind of put it together, put that timeline together, and didn't have all the rest of that stuff that they had to look through 2 and 3 pages of cell phone records. He had the important parts of the timeline there with that. And graphics are wonderful. That's why I love photography so. It tells a story. And then he simplified it down in that PowerPoint presentation, which they did call back for a monitor, and I'm wondering if that's what they were looking at, or either the video again too. And that just kind of simplified it right there after all the testimony they'd had on it for hours and hours and hours. But I thought that was a good point. You have to get that timeline so that the jurors can understand this. And a lot of them was probably like me. They didn't know that all the extensive cell phone records you could get to, follow people around and OnStar. But they know it now. Let me bring one other thing in too.
Please.
This is something that I've always picked up. The psychological profile at SLED taught me this, I think, and he was amazing. He could talk a world out of its hole as far as I'm concerned. And he was amazing. But he said, you listen at the suspected suspect talk, and he's going to tell in that story sometime his truth. And Alex, as my mama would say, he didn't have the truth in him. But Alex said a few things over the time, and one of them was that when he testified, he said, yes, I lied about the dog kennel, being at the dog kennel. He said, but I would never kill my wife Maggie or my son Pawpaw. He would never do that. When he was talking to the first officers on the scene, he kept, how many times did he say, are they dead? Are they dead? Are they dead? To me, that showed he wanted to make sure they were dead so they couldn't talk. Possibly, my thoughts. And he kept telling officers he would cooperate in any way. But he later kept asking, where is it in the investigation? Are y'all looking for something? And that's kind of common for our family. But then again, they never demanded SLED to find out who killed them. They never demanded them to, okay, you've got to find out who did this horrible, horrible thing. And let's see, when his sister-in-law was, Amaga's sister testifies on the stand that Alex said whoever did this had planned it for a long time. And then Alex's word on the stand, he said, yes, I lied about being at the kennels. I was there, but did not kill Maggie and Paul. The boat wreck was the reason Pawpaw and Maggie were killed. I can tell you for a fact that the person or people who did what I saw on June the 7th, they hated Paul Murdaugh, and they had an anger in their hearts. And that is the only reason they could be mad with Paul and hate him like that. And then when he tests his sentencing yesterday, he says, I lied and I continue to lie. And then he followed that with, I would never hurt my wife Maggie or my son Pawpaw. His quick reply was another lie.
And there is his truth. His truth, as you say.
That is true. That is true. He actually told some truth in there, like whoever killed Paul had a hate for him. And telling his sister-in-law, whoever did this had planned it for a long time. And he had to plan a lot of that for the way he got rid of evidence. And I don't know how long it did it, but I don't think he could have come up with it that fast.
Do you think he had any help?
I don't.
No.
I don't.
Like, I'm just thinking of like the bag, like the O.J. Simpson, the bag when he comes back from Chicago, and that bag was never seen again, and the mystery of what was in it. And I was just wondering if there was ever any thought that somebody that maybe he knew took all that stuff, the guns and the clothes, and got rid of it for him. But
I don't think so.
Yeah, and that would probably come out at trial anyway.
Yeah,
so
yeah, I don't think so. And even with that blue raincoat too, he took that in that night. Why did he leave that there? That's a question. Why did he leave that there? Maybe he thought they would never go over to Alameda and process that scene too. But he could have got rid of that along with whatever else he was getting rid of. But I guess some things you're going, oh my God, he finally he made a mistake here, he made a mistake here. You can't wrap your head around it.
The web of lies eventually always unravels, and we are so grateful that justice here was served. Now he goes to if it had just been the financial crimes he'd been convicted of, he would have gone to a low security prison. But since this is a murder charge, he's going to a high security state penitentiary. And I wanted to ask you, Rita, is that the same state penitentiary that Elaine's killer is currently at?
No, Elaine's killer is in a mental institution in Columbia, but it's secured. It's secured. He can never get out of there. They have bars on the windows. It's just like a jail, but they have to deal with the mental issue. Department of Corrections ain't pretty.
I'm happy to hear that, even though that's like bad that people are in jail, but you can't put people in jail and not deal with the mental illnesses that have put them there, because you're going to end up with...
Yeah, the Department of Corrections is a complete different facility where they house the bad guys, the murderers, but also some, the druggies too, the Department of Correction is. And we have, the main one is in Columbia. That would be the one he would probably go to. But we have other Department of Corrections, smaller in different counties here in South Carolina.
Yep. Be interesting to see what his legal team tries to wangle for him.
You never know.
You never know.
You never know. And I think too, after this happened, when they put him in rehab, he was probably in a nice room and all in rehab, but he was in the jail in Columbia, I believe, for his financial crimes, and then they brought him down here for the trial. So I think he's been staying in the Colleton County Jail down here. And that's not the finest place to be in. I'll tell you this.
I don't think any county jail is a good place to be.
I think you've said volumes there.
I think any jail is a bad place to be, just society-wise. But
you've made a bad choice.
I'll tell you one thing. When I saw this yesterday, and it just grind, as my mama said again, grind my gizzard to see him not being in shackles. But I can understand the judge doing that. But then him covering up his handcuffs, walking in the courthouse. When that happened yesterday, I said, he'll go out of here in handcuffs, and he'll come back in handcuffs tomorrow, and he ain't going to have his nice clothes on. That'll be one set of clothes he really wants to get rid of.
Oh, yeah.
But he ain't going to do it. There's no way he can do it.
What?
But that did my heart good.
Yeah. What an end. What an end. So the last question that we have for you, Rita, we always ask about aftermaths. We always ask about kind of where things go at the end of a case like this. And the question that I have for you is, what ripple effects do you see this verdict having for Walterboro and the surrounding counties, for the whole area that used to be under the Murdaugh thumb? I mean, what do you see happening back home?
They will go on living. They will get back to living. This will always be there. It's history now. Not that they wanted it, but it's history now. It'll always be there. But the people in Walterboro, the people in South Carolina are strong, just like when they come back from a hurricane, and we've had many of them. They are strong, they love their community, and they don't like people doing bad in their community. So I think they'll bounce back real good. It'll be talked about forever. And there'll be books about it, I guess. And it'll be in South Carolina's tainted history for years, but we have a lot of them in tainted history. And not that we want it, but it's there. But Walterboro will be fine. They'll be Walterboro proud, just like South Carolina's proud now.
Thanks as always for listening. Our guest has been Rita Shuler, author of The Lowcountry Murder of Gwendolyn Elaine Fogle, a cold case solved, published by the History Press. To order a copy of the book, visit your local independent bookstore, visit arcadiapublishing.com, or check out our Crime Capsule show page at bookshop.org/shop/crime-capsule. Thanks as always to our producer, Bill Huffman, especially for sitting in today and sharing his insights. Thanks as well to our production director, Bridget Coyne, audio engineer, Ian Douglas, our executive producers, Michael D'Aloia and Gerardo Orlando. I'm your host, Benjamin Morris. Crime Capsule is a production of Evergreen Podcasts and is a signature title of the Killer Podcasts Network. You can find Crime Capsule wherever you listen to podcasts. Discover more great true crime and paranormal programming at killerpodcasts.com.
Thank you guys so much for tuning into this special episode of Who Killed? And thank you to Benjamin Morris as well as Rita Shuler of the SLED, South Carolina's Law Enforcement Division, for joining us this week to discuss the Murdaugh murders. And again, I do drop new episodes of Who Killed every Friday. This was a special episode, so look for a new episode next Friday. And again, thanks to you guys for tuning in. It wouldn't be a show without you. Appreciate you across the board. And as always, if you want to follow me on Twitter, you can do so at BillHuffman3. If you feel so inclined, you can donate to the show via my Venmo at WhoKilled. And as always, before next week, stay healthy and be safe.
Hi, Vanessa.
Hi, Amy. And hi, True Crime fans.
We're the co-hosts of She Goes by Jane. Every week, we'll be covering the story of a missing or unidentified woman in the United States.
Stories you may have heard before.
And ones whose stories didn't make it into the news.
We've been covering these stories for a while. First in Amy's book of poetry, Doe.
And then in Vanessa's documentary, She.
But now we want to share them with you here on She Goes by Jane.
And each week we'll be joined by a special guest who will read a poem in honor of the women we talk about. Can we say who?
We can say who. We'll be joined by actresses like Coco Jones and Gabrielle Ruiz.
And musicians like Stephanie Quayle and Kelly Moneymaker, along with authors like Louise Penny
and Catherine McKenzie.
So check out She Goes by Jane wherever you get your podcasts, or check out Evergreen Podcasts and their true crime channel, Killer Podcasts.
We can't wait to bring you these stories.
Coming up on 5 Minute News, I'm Anthony Davis. You might think it's partisan because maybe it's critical of one side or the other, but it's not. It's just the truth. And I think that's also something that's kind of unusual for Americans listening to the radio or to podcasts, because the news landscape in the States has been so partisan for so many decades. So 5 Minute News is verified, truthful, independent, unbiased, and essential world news daily.